At 4:23 this morning, seismologists at Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, known by its Italian initials INGV, recorded a magnitude 4.7 earthquake originating beneath the Naples metropolitan area. No adjectives yet, just the raw finding: a mid-sized quake on a Tuesday morning in a city of roughly 3 million people. Not a routine tremor, not the kind of brief shudder that residents of one of Europe's most seismically active regions have felt their whole lives, the kind that rattles a shelf, settles within seconds, and gets one line of conversation the next morning before everyone moves on. This one lasted longer than a typical 4.7 usually does. It was felt simultaneously across a wide geographic footprint, from the dense historic center near the bay, out to the coastal towns south of the city, up into the volcanic hillside neighborhoods above it, and across communities that this earthquake was about to put directly in harm's way through a mechanism most people outside Italy have never heard of. Within seconds of the shaking stopping, sections of hillside gave way on roads carved into volcanic terrain, the same dramatic slopes that have made this bay one of the most photographed coastlines in the world. Rock and debris that had held in place for generations came down onto roads below, roads that had vehicles on them at that exact hour, because Naples at 4:23 a.m. is not an empty city. It's a city of delivery drivers restocking shops before daylight, fishermen heading out or coming back in, and overnight shift workers making their way home. The images that reached international coverage within the first hour of daylight showed what happens when debris arrives from directly above a vehicle, rather than from any direction a driver's instincts or reaction time could realistically prepare for. But here's the part of this story that matters more than the magnitude number and more than the images. The earthquake itself was not really the surprising event. What is surprising, and what most coverage of mornings like this one gets wrong, is why a moderate 4.7 quake, the kind that would rattle windows and little else in most cities on Earth, was capable of producing a lethal secondary hazard here specifically. If you have family in Naples, or you're one of the roughly 500,000 people who live their entire daily lives inside the volcanic caldera sitting beneath a large portion of this city, then understanding that mechanism is not an academic exercise. It is the difference between knowing which roads to avoid on a morning like this one and finding out the hard way. By the time you finish this video, you will understand several things clearly. You will understand exactly what produced the ground motion Naples experienced this morning in plain physical terms, without the jargon that usually clutters this kind of coverage. You will understand why a 4.7 a magnitude earthquake generated consequences that a 4.7 would not generate in most other geological settings on the planet, and what specifically makes the hillsides above Naples so vulnerable to earthquake-triggered rockslides. You will understand the broader seismic and volcanic context this morning's earthquake sits inside. A slow-building episode of unrest beneath the Campi Flegrei caldera that has been accelerating for more than a decade, and what Italy's own monitoring agencies are actually saying about it, as opposed to what gets amplified on social media. And you will come away with a clear, practical sense of what the roughly 3 million people who live in and around Naples should actually be doing about all of this today, calmly, without either panic or complacency, because both of those responses are wrong in their own way. If you want accurate, evidence-based coverage of the Campi Flegrei situation as it develops, subscribe right now, because this is not a single isolated event you can watch once and move on from. It is one data point in a sequence that has been building for months, and updates will be coming as INGV's monitoring network releases new information through the day and in the days ahead. I also want to ask you something specific, not the generic, where are you watching from? A question you'll see under most videos like this one. If you live in or near Naples, or you have family there, or you have ever felt the ground move in that region yourself, tell me in the comments what it felt like, where you were, and what you did in the minutes afterward. First-hand accounts from people with direct experience add something theseismological data alone cannot provide, a ground-level texture to a story that otherwise lives entirely in instrument readings and press releases. To understand why this morning's earthquake behaved the way it did, you need to understand the ground Naples is actually built on. And the clearest way to picture the core mechanism is a bicycle pump. Push air into a tire, and the internal pressure rises, and the rubber stretches and swells outward as a result. Stop pumping, or let some air escape through a valve, and the tire settles back down. Underneath the western half of Naples sits something functioning in a broadly similar way, except instead of air, the substance involved is magma, volcanic gas, and superheated water trapped in a shallow underground system. And instead of a tire, the structure holding all of that is a roughly 13-kilometer wide underground system called Campi Flegrei, which translates from Italian as burning fields. It does not look like a volcano in the way most people picture one. There is no single dramatic cone dominating the skyline, the way there is a few kilometers away at Mount Vesuvius, the volcano that destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum in the year 79, and that last erupted in 1944. Campi Flegrei is a caldera instead, A wide, shallow, bowl-shaped depression in the landscape formed roughly 40,000 years ago when a massive eruption emptied an enormous underground magma chamber, and the ground above it collapsed inward to fill the resulting void. That collapsed structure is roughly 13 kilometers across. It does not sit off in some remote, empty stretch of countryside. Large portions of western Naples, the entire town of Pozzuoli, and a bay separating the caldera's outer rim from the islands of Ischia and Procida all sit directly on top of it. When pressure builds in the magmatic and hydrothermal fluid system beneath that caldera, the ground surface actually rises, sometimes by a meaningful number of centimeters over the course of months or years. When that pressure eases, whether because fluid migrates elsewhere or gas escapes through natural vents, the ground sinks back down. Geologists have a specific name for this slow vertical movement, bradyseism. It is not a new phenomenon at Campi Flegrei, and it is not something that started with the current episode of unrest. The historical record of it is preserved in stone, quite literally, at a site in Pozzuoli known as the Macellum, an ancient Roman marketplace building whose surviving marble columns are still standing nearly 2,000 years after they were built. If you look closely at those columns, today, you can see bands of small burrow holes at roughly eye level, left behind by marine mollusks that bore into stone sitting at the waterline. Those burrow marks appear at multiple different heights along the columns, which is only possible if the ground beneath that structure has sunk low enough to let seawater flood in, then risen again high enough to expose the columns to air, and repeated that cycle more than once over the centuries. It is one of the more remarkable pieces of physical evidence anywhere in the world for long-term ground deformation, hiding in plain sight in what most visitors treat as an ordinary archaeological ruin. The current episode of uplift at Campi Flegrei began building gradually in the late 1960s, went through periods of acceleration and relative quiet over the following decades, and has picked up sharply and consistently since around 2012. Since that acceleration began, the ground surface at Pozzuoli has climbed by more than a meter compared to its lowest point recorded during the 20th century. That is not a small or purely cosmetic shift. A rise of that magnitude, sustained over more than a decade, reflects real ongoing pressurization of the shallow magmatic and hydrothermal system directly beneath a populated town. And the same pressurization process driving the ground upward is also the process generating the earthquakes associated with this unrest. As pressurized fluid and volcanic gas migrate upward through fractured rock, they place stress on pre-existing faults and fracture planes within that rock. And when that stress exceeds what the rock can hold, it breaks or slips suddenly, releasing energy as an earthquake. Most of these events are extremely small, well below the threshold that a human being standing at the surface would ever notice, and they show up only on INGV's seismic instruments. Some are large enough to be felt clearly across the metropolitan area. This morning's 4.7 falls into that second category, and it was large enough to trigger the kind of secondary geological consequence that most urban earthquakes of similar size in most other cities simply do not produce. So why exactly did a moderate 4.7 earthquake send rock crashing down onto roads, rather than just rattling a few windows and cracking some plaster the way a similar quake would in a city built on flat ground? The answer lies in the specific material composing the hills that ring much of Naples. A large share of that high ground is built from volcanic tuff, a rock type formed when ash and other fragmented volcanic material from earlier eruptions, both from Vesuvius and from Campi Flegrei itself, gets compacted and partially fused together over time by heat and pressure. Tuff has genuinely useful engineering properties in one specific direction. It has good compressive strength, meaning it holds up well under weight pressing straight down on it, which is exactly why the ancient Romans quarried it extensively as a building material, and why so much of historic Naples, including buildings still standing and in use today, rests on tuff foundations. But that same rock has a very different relationship with sideways, or shear, forces, the kind that try to slide one layer of material against another rather than simply pressing down on it. Picture a pile of damp sand on a beach. Left alone, it holds a stable shape indefinitely. Push it firmly from the side, even briefly, and a section of it slumps and slides all at once because the internal friction holding the grains together was never designed to resist that kind of sideways force. Slopes made of volcanic tuff behave in a broadly comparable way at a much larger and more dangerous scale. Under ordinary static conditions, with outside forces acting on it, a tough hillside stays stable because the downward pull of gravity on that slope is balanced by the sheer strength holding the rock together along potential failure planes running roughly parallel to the slope's surface. That balance can hold for decades, even generations, with no visible sign of instability. An earthquake changes that balance instantly, even if only for a few seconds. The sudden ground acceleration from seismic shaking adds an additional force acting on the slope. And critically, it also temporarily reduces the effective shear strength holding potential failure planes together. If the added force from the earthquake, combined with that momentary reduction in strength, is enough to tip the balance so that gravity's pull down the slope exceeds what the weakened rock can resist. The slope fails. There is no second warning once that threshold is crossed. The material above the failure plane simply begins moving, pulled downward by gravity alone, traveling at whatever speed the height and steepness of that particular slope allows, with nothing below it on the road or at the base of that slope receiving any advance notice at all. The specific roads affected by this morning's rock slides were not obscure or lightly used routes tucked away from daily life. They are roads cut into or running directly along the base of that volcanic hillside terrain, carrying regular commuter and commercial traffic that connects communities living on these slopes above with the urban fabric of the city below. In the pre-dawn hours, those same roads carry a specific and predictable category of traffic: delivery vehicles restocking businesses ahead of the morning rush, fishermen either heading out for the day or returning from overnight work, and shift workers making their way home from jobs that keep a city of 3 million people running around the clock. A 4.7 earthquake, striking at 4:23 in the morning, placed a specific group of road users on those affected routes that the exact same earthquake striking at, say, 2 in the afternoon would not have placed there in nearly the same numbers. People were on those roads specifically because the early hours are relatively quiet, using that quiet to move through the city efficiently, with no way to know that quiet stretch of road above them was, for a few seconds, mechanically unstable. The emergency response to the rock slide scenes in the minutes and hours following the earthquake involved a full deployment of fire service rescue units, ambulance crews, and law enforcement personnel. Critically, those were the same limited pool of resources simultaneously fielding an entirely separate stream of calls from across the broader metropolitan area. Residents reporting cracked building facades, objects shaken from shelves, and the general aftermath that any moderate earthquake produces in a city with a substantial inventory of older, mixed-age building stock. That simultaneous demand on emergency communication systems and physical response resources, coming from both the rockslide casualties and the wider earthquake aftermath at the same time, is a specific operational challenge that emergency planners in Naples have been actively incorporating into their response frameworks throughout the years of accelerating Campi Flegrei Unrest. Precisely because this kind of dual-front demand is a predictable feature of this particular geological setting, rather than a one-off complication. It's worth stepping back at this point and putting some real numbers on the scale of who is actually living inside this system, because abstract talk of unrest understates what's at stake. Roughly 500,000 people live their entire daily lives within the boundaries of the Campi Flegrei caldera itself, spread across Pozzuoli and the western districts of Naples, and the smaller municipalities ringing the bay toward Ischia and Procida. That is, a population comparable to a mid-sized American city. And every one of those people is going to work, raising children, running businesses, and generally conducting the full range of ordinary human activity directly on top of a volcanic system that has been in an accelerating state of unrest for the better part of the past decade. A separate but related population, roughly 700,000 people, lives within the designated red zone around Mount Vesuvius, the zone considered most directly exposed to that volcano's own potential future eruptions. Italy's Civil Protection Authority has revised the formal Vesuvius emergency evacuation plan multiple times over the past 2 decades, as both the scientific understanding of that volcano and the population distribution within its hazard zone have continued to evolve. These are 2 separate geological systems, Campi Flegrei to the west and northwest of Naples, and Vesuvius to the southeast. And either one on its own would be enough to define the seismic and volcanic character of this region. Naples sits at the intersection of both. The last time pressure buildup at Campi Flegrei became serious enough to force people out of their homes on a large scale was during 1983 and 1984, when roughly 40,000 residents of Pozzuoli were evacuated as a precautionary measure during an earlier bradyseismic episode, one that in terms of ground uplift rate was significant by the standards of the time, but that the current episode has since exceeded. Today, Italy's Civil Protection Authority maintains Campi Flegrei at what is officially called the yellow alert level within the Italian volcanic alert classification system. That system runs, broadly speaking, from a baseline green level through yellow, then orange, and finally red, with each step reflecting a different combination of monitoring intensity and the population's proximity to required protective action. Yellow specifically reflects elevated monitoring attention and a heightened preparedness posture without indicating that an eruption is considered imminent. That distinction between elevated monitoring and imminent eruption is not a minor technicality. It is the single most important piece of context for understanding what INGV and civil protection are actually telling the public right now. And it is also the piece of context that gets flattened or lost most often in viral coverage of any Campi Flegrei earthquake. INGV's monitoring of Campi Flegrei represents one of the densest and most technologically sophisticated volcanic and seismic instrument networks deployed around any volcanic system anywhere in the world. And it is worth understanding briefly what that network actually measures, because the different instruments are tracking at genuinely different physical processes. Seismometers positioned across the caldera measure ground motion at high spatial resolution, allowing scientists to locate individual earthquakes precisely and track how seismicity patterns shift over time. GPS stations and a satellite-based technique called INSAR, which stands for Interferometric Synthetic Aperture Radar, track the physical deformation of the ground surface itself, the rising and sinking that defines bradyseism, with a level of precision fine enough to detect movement of just a few millimeters. Gravimeters measure subtle changes in the density of subsurface material, which can indicate fluid or gas migrating through the system at depth, sometimes before that migration produces detectable earthquakes or surface deformation. And geochemical monitoring tracks the composition and temperature of gas emissions from the caldera's fumarole fields, particularly a well-studied site called the Solfatara crater, providing information about the temperature and chemical makeup of the hydrothermal system connecting deep magma to the surface. No single one of these instruments, on its own, would give scientists a reliable picture of what the system is doing. Together, they form a genuinely comprehensive, continuously updated dataset that Italian volcanologists use to assess the state of the system day by day. What that combined dataset has been showing over the past several years describes a system that is more energetic than it has been at any point in the recent historical record. The rate of ground uplift at Pozzuoli has been running at levels that exceed those recorded during the bradyseismic episodes of the 1970s and the early 1980s, the same episodes significant enough at the time to trigger that precautionary evacuation of roughly 40,000 residents. The seismicity rate, meaning the number of detectable earthquakes occurring per unit of time, has been elevated above background levels for an extended period, with swarms of small earthquakes occurring at increasing frequency and intensity as the stressed, fractured rock within the shallow caldera system continues responding to the pressurization happening beneath it. Fumarole temperatures at Solfatara have been rising over this same period, and the geochemical composition of the gas being emitted has been showing changes consistent with an increasing input of magmatic gas originating from deeper in the system into the shallower hydrothermal system closer to the surface. None of those individual observations, and none of them combined, currently allows INGV or any other credible scientific institution to state with confidence that a volcanic eruption at Campi Flegrei is imminent. Volcanic systems around the world showing indicators of unrest resolve without erupting far more often than they precede actual eruption. And Campi Flegrei's own long history includes multiple past episodes of significant uplift and seismicity that eased back down without any eruption occurring. The monitoring data currently describes a system that is more pressurized than it has been in the recent record, which is a meaningfully different statement than a system that is demonstrably approaching an imminent surface eruption and collapsing. That distinction is exactly the kind of misrepresentation that damages public trust in the institutions whose assessments matter most, if and when the situation genuinely does change. What the monitoring data does clearly justify is the conclusion that the current phase of Campi Flegrei unrest is producing seismicity at magnitudes and frequencies that create real, immediate hazard for the communities living within and immediately adjacent to the caldera, through exactly the rockslide and structural damage mechanisms this morning's 4.7 has now demonstrated firsthand. That earthquake hazard is a near-term, concrete risk that does not require any further progression toward volcanic eruption in order to be significant on its own terms. Earthquakes generated by the caldera's pressurized, shallow structure have been occurring at increasing rates over recent years, and this morning's 4.7, viewed within the context of that ongoing unrest episode, is neither a surprise nor a statistical outlier. It is an event broadly consistent, with a system operating at the level of activity that the past several years of accelerating unrest have already established as the new normal for this particular caldera. It's worth putting this morning's event in a wider historical frame, because Naples' relationship with seismic risk did not begin with the current Campi Flegrei unrest, and understanding that longer history helps explain both the resilience and the potential vulnerability of the population living there today. In 1980, a magnitude 6.9 earthquake struck the wider Campania region to the east of Naples, an event known as the Irpinia earthquake, named for the mountainous area where it was centered. That earthquake killed nearly 3,000 people across the region and left hundreds of thousands of people homeless, a scale of destruction that this morning's 4.7 comes nowhere close to matching, but one that remains within living memory for a meaningful share of the current population and their families. That event, along with the repeated bradyseismic episodes that have caused visible ground movement within the lifetimes of current residents, and the continuous physical presence of Vesuvius on the southern horizon, as a permanent, visible reminder that this region's geological history is far from concluded, has produced a population with genuine, multi-generational cultural memory of living alongside serious geological risk. That cultural familiarity has real, tangible value. It has produced a population that is, in a number of important respects, better calibrated to the reality of living in a seismically and volcanically active landscape than populations in regions where major geological events are rare enough that risk awareness fades out of everyday cultural consciousness between generations. Neapolitans, broadly speaking, do not panic at minor seismic events. Many residents have inherited or personally learned frameworks for processing the simple information that the ground is moving, and for distinguishing reasonably well between tremors that call for immediate action and tremors that warrant attention and continued monitoring without a dramatic response in the moment. But that same deep familiarity carries a genuine, well-documented risk of its own: habituation. This is the well-established tendency for people who have experienced many small and moderate events without severe personal consequences to gradually, often unconsciously, underestimate the probability that some future event on the same system will be significantly more severe than anything they have personally lived through so far. This morning's 4.7 was not severe enough to cause building collapses across the urban fabric of the city. INGV has reported no confirmed structural collapses attributable to the shaking itself, and the reported building damage falls largely into the category of cracked facades, fallen plaster, and other non-structural damage typical of a moderate earthquake, striking a city with genuinely mixed building stock, ranging from ancient masonry structures to modern reinforced concrete construction. The rockslide consequences were severe and, in some cases, tragic for the specific vehicles and individuals directly struck. But geographically speaking, those consequences were concentrated on a limited number of slope-adjacent roads rather than distributed broadly across the wider urban fabric of the city. The genuine risk in the habituation dynamic that plays out in a setting like this one is that every individual, moderate event that passes without producing severe, widespread consequences quietly reinforces a mental model in which moderate events, by their nature, don't produce severe, widespread consequences. That mental model is entirely accurate as a description of any single individual event viewed in isolation. What it fails to account for is the underlying statistical reality that a geological system generating moderate earthquakes at an increasing frequency will, eventually, generate a larger event somewhere within its full range of physical capability, and that the level of preparedness appropriate for a moderate 4.7 is meaningfully inadequate for the larger event the same system remains fully capable of producing. The comparison that illustrates this habituation risk most directly does not come from Italy's own seismic record. It comes from the 2023 Kahramanmaraş earthquake sequence in Turkey. That sequence began with a magnitude 7.8 main shock in February 2023 that killed more than 50,000 people across southeastern Turkey and northern Syria, making it one of the deadliest earthquake disasters anywhere in the world in recent decades. The Kahramanmaraş region had experienced moderate earthquake activity for years leading up to that main shock. Residents there were accustomed to feeling the ground move periodically. Many had personally lived through moderate seismic events that caused limited, manageable damage. The cultural expectations and institutional emergency frameworks that governed the region's relationship with seismic risk had, understandably, been calibrated over time to the moderate events people had actually experienced. Those frameworks proved catastrophically inadequate the moment the underlying fault system produced an event near the upper end of its physical capability, rather than an event closer to the middle of its historical range that residents had grown used to. To be absolutely clear about the limits of this comparison, the parallel between Kahramanmaraş and Naples is not a claim that an event of that scale is imminent, or even statistically probable in the near term for Campi Flegrei. The tectonic and volcanic setting driving Campi Flegrei's seismicity is genuinely different from the fault system responsible for the Kahramanmaraş sequence, and the specific mechanisms, timelines, and realistic scales of potential future events differ significantly between the two settings. The parallel worth taking seriously is narrower and more specific. It is the habituation dynamic itself, the demonstrated way that a sustained pattern of moderate seismic events, occurring without catastrophic consequences, can gradually and quietly erode the level of preparedness that the full physical range of a system's capability genuinely warrants, regardless of the specific geology involved. This morning's 4.7 is not a catastrophe measured against the full scale of what the Campi Flegrei system could eventually produce. It is best understood as a clear, current demonstration of the system's ongoing activity, And as a useful, timely reminder that preparedness calibrated specifically to 4.7 magnitude events is not the same thing as preparedness calibrated to the fuller range of what the Campi Flegrei and Vesuvius systems, separately and in combination, remain physically capable of producing over a longer time horizon. Italy's Civil Protection Authority maintains emergency planning for both the Campi Flegrei and Vesuvius systems that ranks among the most detailed and carefully developed volcanic and seismic emergency response frameworks anywhere in the world. The Vesuvius Emergency Plan specifically, which covers the roughly 700,000 people living within that volcano's designated red zone, has been revised multiple times over the past 2 decades, as scientific understanding of the volcano's behavior has advanced and as the actual population distribution within the hazard zone has continued to shift. The Campi Flegrei Emergency Planning Framework has likewise been progressively updated as the current unrest episode has developed, with civil protection working to ensure communities within the caldera have current, accurate information about evacuation procedures, designated shelter locations, and the alert level system that would govern any escalation of protective actions should the monitoring data eventually indicate a clear progression toward more dangerous conditions. The gap that exists between the detailed plans sitting on paper at the institutional level and the actual practical preparedness present in individual homes, workplaces, and communities within the hazard zone is a gap that exists to some degree in essentially every major volcanic and seismic hazard zone in the world. And Naples is not an exception to that broader pattern. The most specific, urgent action this morning's earthquake creates for residents of the Campi Flegrei area and the wider Naples metropolitan region is closing that particular gap at the individual and household level, converting a general awareness that an official plan exists somewhere into concrete personal knowledge of exactly what that plan actually requires of each individual household in the specific scenarios it addresses.